Ikim Inspirasi Inforia Islami. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to our Ikim Radio listeners. You are with me, Annie Zahura Abdul Aziz, your host for today's episode of Open Forum. And inshallah, in today's episode, we have with us, a scholar from all the way from Australia. We have Dr. Daud Batchelor, who will be talking about a very interesting, very important topic that is relevant and that is, I think, it needs awareness with regard to this topic, which is impacting Earth more, rising population or excessive consumption. Before we proceed further with our discussion, Dr. Daud, I would just like to briefly introduce you to our fellow listeners this afternoon. Dr. Daud is currently an adjunct fellow at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, AIS Malaysia, where he did the Science, Technology, Environment and Ethics unit. You have a multidisciplinary background with an MA from the International Institute for Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, Kuala Lumpur. And also you have a PhD degree from the University of Malaya. You also have a Masters of Engineering Science from Griffith University. And we know that you are your research on this area, which is very important and very crucial to understanding the issues that we are facing as human. It's it's an issue that must concern everyone, and we must understand this. We go straight to our question, Dr. Daud, because we only have this precious 30 minutes with you. So we are going straight to the question. When we're talking about the current environmental crisis, we're talking about the degradation or the condition of the earth today. It is a sign of the failure of mankind in fulfilling their responsibilities as custodian of the earth. Can you just share with our listeners about the aspect from the Islamic perspective, Dr. Daud, if you may?
As-salatu was-salam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. Thanks for your invitation to join you today, and nice to be involved in IKIM program. Alhamdulillah. Well, I would say that the scripture that we have from Islamic teachings is very rich, and is very helpful in addressing the environmental crisis that we're facing today. And I just mentioned I benefited from my mentors, Professors Osman Bakar and Mohammed Hashim Kamali, who have both published in this field. And we're facing actually three environmental crises: climate change, loss of biodiversity, and thirdly, industrial pollution. So let's look at the scriptural sources. And first of all, we refer to Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30, where God breathed his spirit directly into Adam on his creation and appointed us as Adam's descendants to be his custodians or khulafa on earth. Inni ja'alun fil ardi khalifatan. So we all have a role and duty as custodians to look after the earth. So that's the first. And the Noble Quran goes on to state in translation that in Surah Al-Isra, verse 44, that the seven heavens and the earth and all that is therein glorify him, and there is not a thing but it glorifies his praise. We therefore need to approach nature as being sacred. And further, God tells us in Surah Ar-Rahman, the sky has he raised high and devised for all things a balance, a mizan, so never transgress the balance. Weigh therefore your deeds with equity and do not upset the balance. The value of balance or mizan emerges from the concept of universal harmony. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ advised his followers to limit their consumption of resources. He reprimanded one companion for using excessive amounts of water for ablution. So moderation is required to maintain the balance, and transgressing it has disastrous consequences. So God says, never transgress the balance. And he further says in Surah Al-Araf 7, verse 56, do not corrupt the earth after it has been set right. And further, he says in Surah Al-An'am 6, verse 141, do not be wasteful. God does not like wasteful people. But mankind has upset the balances in the world ecosystems, and we are starting to feel the consequences. In the current Anthropocene age, nature is for many no longer regarded as sacred, but as something to be dominated. This emptiness within human souls manifests itself, causing problems such as the destruction of natural beauty and rise in mental illnesses. God says in Surah Al-Mudathir 74, verses 11 to 15, leave me alone to deal with man, to whom I granted vast resources, and to whom I have given so generously, and yet he greedily desires even more. When man's inner being darkens as a result of modern materialistic conceptions, nature is turned from harmony to disorder. Pollution and injustice against Earth's creatures results from greed and corruption in human hearts. In Romans 30, verse 41, God states about the present condition, corruption has appeared on land and sea because of what the hands of people have earned. So God may let them taste part of the consequences of their deeds, that perhaps they will return to righteousness. So we see the bad consequences from resources over exploitation. And the global average temperature has risen 1.1 degrees Celsius in the past 110 years. And in Malaysia, climate change has caused an increase in surrounding mean seawater temperatures, causing higher annual rainfalls. This, together with around 20 centimeters sea level rise in the past 30 years, causes greater flooding, such as we see more frequently on the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia and the Klang Valley. And Malaysia's 30% loss of tree cover in the past 20 years exacerbates flooding, such as we saw recently in the Baling area in Kedah. So that is my response to that question.
Yeah, you have actually, explained to us, what is there, especially in the Quran, with regard to our role as the custodian of the earth, as the guardian, as steward. I think this is a very important element that some of us fail to understand, Dr. Daud. And when talking about climate change and environmental degradation, what is being corrupted is actually the consequences of human being, where they're being irresponsible towards the earth, towards environment, and so on. Dr. Daud, when we're talking about earth, when talking about climate change, we are talking, there are no other factors, there are factors which are very much important in understanding what's happening to the world today. One of the factor I think that you've mentioned in many and some of your recent research is about the issue of rising population, Dr. Daud. So, in what way is rising population a factor to this issue, especially the condition of the new environmental degradation, Dr. Daud? If you may share with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you, and Zahora, for that important question. Well, scientists call this currently the Anthropocene age because humans since 1950 have clearly affected the face of the earth, causing environmental changes, massive changes, including climate change. A simple, effective formula that I use relates the scale of environmental impacts as a function of three factors or variables. Firstly is population, which you just mentioned, then technology, and thirdly, affluence or consumption. So governments normally address the chief factor, technology, while we today will be probably talking more about population and affluence factors. We'll consider evidences whether it is global population growth or excessive resources consumption, which is a greater driver of emissions and environmental destruction. We can then reach a conclusion allowing positive action to improve Earth's condition, inshallah. So currently there are 7.7 billion people living on Earth, and Muslims represent about a quarter. And the United Nations predicts that Earth's rising population will plateau around 11 billion population by 2100. And the United States Pew Center have stated that although the overall population growth rates are falling, Muslim populations are increasing twice as fast as world population growth rate, mainly due to the high fertility of Muslim women, who have about 2.9 children per woman, compared to non-Muslim women, where they have about 2.2 on average children. So a question arises, should Muslims contribute to stabilize Earth's population in order to protect and nurture a healthy living environment upon which our own well-being depends by reducing our population growth rate? Certainly, major impacts occur from growth in population numbers in general. Humans clear forests and occupy natural lands for their habitations. They grow crops. They need space to manufacture goods and for transport and power generation. And these all cause pollution as well. Let's look further at a few specific examples of the effects of human population growth. Lake Chad in West Africa, for instance, contracted 90% of its lake area since the 1960s, and this has affected the 20 to 30 million human beneficiaries that live surrounding it. And this is partly due to population growth that it has contracted. Secondly, the global population proportion living under chronic water stress has increased from just 9% in 1960 to 35% in 2005. So water scarcity is particularly serious today in the Middle East. And this is partly due to the consumption of limited groundwater resources there. And I will end with on this question by citing the biologist Thomas Lovejoy, who highlighted the link between population growth, vulnerable ecosystems, and climate change. He said that it's the poorest areas that disproportionately feel the effects of climate change. Over exploitation and habitat loss as a result of population pressures is accelerating the extinction of plant and animal species, undermining the poor societies in parts of the world where people are heavily dependent on nature for their livelihoods. And areas of rapid population growth overlay those with high numbers of threatened and vulnerable plant species. So you can see there's definitely a link between rising population and environmental degradation.
Thank you, Dr. Daud, with regard to this question. But I believe that Muslims, when it comes to the issue of population, um, uh, traditionally, Muslims believe that it is a religious duty to produce a large community. So, when we're talking about this and how rising population is actually an issue with regard to climate change, um, how does Islam approach on this? I mean, what is the Islamic perspective on this issue of population growth? If you may share, Dr. Daud.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, I researched this, and my article is published in the Islamic Civilizational Journal on Civilization Renewal. Uh, so historically, I can say that Islamic scholars debated about the validity of contraception. And family planning now is widely adopted in Muslim countries and endorsed by their ulama.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, as you said, Muslims believe it was a religious duty to produce a large ummah.
Yeah.
Current conditions are, however, different. In
Mm-hmm.
classical times, the ummah was small, but today the ummah's numbers are huge and growing fast.
Mm-hmm.
So, based on the Quranic, sort of looking into solutions on how to address this, um, I would say that based on the Quranic verse in Surah Al-Aqaf 46, verse 15, um, Allah mentions about human, babies that his bearing and weaning is 30 months. And together with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his encouragement um, for or discouragement for suckling mothers to become pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
there's a scholarly consensus which encourages mothers to space births over at least 30 to 33-month intervals.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the from the scriptural guidance. Muslim governments promoted family planning to engender societal well-being with better women's health and strong offspring as priorities. Offspring who can be provided with good Islamic upbringing and good health and education. So, critically evaluating this issue from the perspectives of the Maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives of Islamic law,
Mm-hmm.
preserving life, religion, intellect, progeny, and wealth, can say that high population growth exacerbates climate change and harm to life, such as we see with rising seas impacting on low-lying communities in Bangladesh and the Pacific Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also impacts on wealth because we see a steadily unsustainable reduction in Earth's natural wealth and productive capacity, especially with the decline in marine food resources. Also, we consider the Islamic legal maxim that averting harm is preferable to securing benefit. So this suggests that any benefits of having a quite a large family may be unacceptable with the severe harm from population growth to the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge to Muslims is seeking to space births um, and to avoid by spacing births and having fewer children, but we want to avoid you know uh, the possibility that instead we become wastefully consumerist materialists, which would impact on Earth sustainability even more, which we see in the affluent countries to a large extent. So Muslims can reduce family sizes while avoiding unnecessary consumption and so become God-conscious stewards, protecting Earth's environment while raising well-educated children dutiful to their parents and to their Lord, to Allah.
So I believe, from what you have explained, is now maybe we should shift on looking at the quality of the ummah than the quantity of of the ummah, especially in you've mentioned about how offspring should be given good health, good education and so on in order for us to address this issue. So looking at the quality is very important with regard to upbringing of children, especially, and creating that awareness about their role as steward, as guardian, as khalifa in protecting the earth. So you've mentioned about excessive consumption, Dr. Daud. You've talked about how it actually affect climate change. How does this possible? How does excessive consumption affect climate change? And what does Islam say about this aspect of consumer behavior, Dr. Daud?
Okay, well, currently I would start by pointing out that the average global citizen is already consuming about 1.7 times the Earth's biocapacity. So it takes Earth 1 year and 8 months to regenerate what resources that mankind is using annually. When the global ecological footprint of the average person is greater than Earth's biocapacity, we call this overshoot. And resources consumption ties closely with carbon emissions. So I'll use these terms interchangeably because they are closely related. Certain affluent countries, such as my own, Australia, consume much more than the average. And if all global citizens consumed as much as the average Australian, then we would need 5 Earths, which of course is impossible. In 2022, Australia's global footprint is 7.3 hectares per person. So it needs 7.3 hectares of global space to support one Australian. While for Malaysia, it is just 3.9 and has reduced actually in the last few years from what it was before. So clearly, then, we all need to live sustainable lifestyles to protect Earth and our own well-being. So, in terms of looking at population growth, we can look at national total fertility rates, which is the basically the number of children per woman in her lifetime that she will have. For Australia and the United States, it's 1.7, and this compares with Nigeria, which is 4.7, and Bangladesh, which is 2.1. I believe Malaysia is around about 2.1 as well. So birth rates of many developing Muslim countries, the total fertility rates are 1.5 to 3.5 times higher than that of wealthy countries. So that is the situation in comparing, the population growth between, developing countries and most Muslim countries and the West, affluent countries.
Mhm.
However, Australians and Americans generate excessive annual carbon dioxide emissions, which in tons per head is about 16 per year, which is 10 to 25 times the generation of carbon dioxide emissions of Indonesia and Nigeria. So it's a very much greater rate of emissions. So clearly, if people in poorer countries reduce birth rates, this will have a minor effect on global carbon emissions, which are mainly generated in the more wealthy countries. Although we must, of course, continue the efforts and make greater efforts ourselves to reduce emissions, even in countries like Indonesia and Nigeria and Malaysia and so forth. What are the causes of these greater emissions? Well, for a start, the size of homes is the largest globally in Australia and the United States.
Mm.
Consequently, more forest is cleared of trees and animals to allow this unsustainable lifestyle. And also resulting from high food wastage. The cleared area for farming must be greater to produce sufficient food. So all of this clearing reduces carbon dioxide absorption capacity of the environment due to our, excessively consuming lifestyles. And I just want to mention now a very important finding of scholars Murtagh and Schlach published in 2008, who estimated that the lifetime carbon dioxide emissions of having one child in the United States, the total lifetime emissions were calculated at 9,441 tons. This is 86 times greater than that of a child born in Nigeria and 169 times that of a child born in Bangladesh. So these are major scales of factors of emissions resulting from much greater consumption rates than in these developing countries, and Nigeria, which has a high birth rate. So population growth, like from that data, you can clearly see that um, that although population growth is causing significant environmental impacts on Earth, however, the much bigger impact is from the materialist consumptive culture in the West and newly industrialized countries. And United States Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez highlighted that climate change is even forcing American young people to reconsider having children at all. And moving away from nations, but focusing on wealthy people themselves and their effects, we find that the world's richest people are actually driving the major drivers or strongest drivers of global warming. Personal wealth does more than national wealth to explain the source of emissions. So we find that Oxfam reported that the richest 10% of the world population were responsible for 50% of total carbon dioxide emissions, while the poorest 50% is responsible for only 10% of emissions. And the world's richest 1% emit about 70 times as much carbon as the bottom 50% of emitters. So, what is the characteristic um, manner of causing such emissions? Well, we looked at the consumptive habits, and we find that higher up on the income distribution, emissions increase exponentially. For instance, the single most polluting asset is a super yacht, which saw a 77% surge in sales last year.
Mhm.
And an 11-minute ride into space, like the one taken by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, is
Mhm.
responsible for more carbon emissions per passenger than the lifetime emissions. That 11 minutes ride, more than the lifetime emissions of any one of the world's poorest billion people. So, conclusion is that we see much greater global climate impacts from excessive consumptive culture in the West and newly industrialized countries than from population growth in developing countries. So, research confirms that excessive consumption in wealthy and newly industrialized countries is much greater contributor to carbon emissions and climate change than is population growth in the developing world. And I'll stop there on that question because time is running out.
Yeah. Um, Thank you, Dr. Daud, for highlighting the fact. But maybe just as a conclusion, I think well, what we need to know that we see around us that climate change is happening. There's problem of environmental degradation, and we feel that's happening in the world today. Maybe as your last message to our listeners, what should Muslims especially do to undertake more effective roles in addressing the problems of climate change? Dr. Dawood, if you may share with our listeners.
Yes, well, happy to answer on that topic. And I would say that we as Muslims have great insightful teachings, which should ensure we do not blindly follow a materialistic culture, but heed the Islamic call to purify the soul, not be extravagant or wasteful, tread the world lightly, live in the world as a traveler, traveling lightly, plant trees, and steward the earth to maintain its natural balance. We individually, however, are duty bound to look inward to what we can change for the benefit of ourselves and to ensure a sound, sustainable environment for future generations. And I would just like to refer, I don't know whether your listeners will see this book.
Our viewers, yeah, will definitely see it.
Yeah, okay. It's called,
Can you just
it's
again
written by
leave the
Mark.
book, Dr. Daud? Sorry. Can you just leave the book so that our viewers can actually look at it?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll hold it
Okay.
up.
All right. So
So
thank you.
this is written by Mark Delaney, called Low Carbon and Loving It.
Mhm.
And I have a high regard for his recommendations. on priority ways to reduce carbon emissions and protect
Right.
the environment. Firstly, he says increase the purchase of secondhand goods rather than new goods.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, reduce meat consumption, especially red meat. Thirdly, reduce car travel and use more public transport. Fourthly, reduce long distance air travel. Fifthly, use more rooftop solar generated power and reduce air conditioner use. Sixthly, ensure that your house size is less than 45 square meters per resident. And finally, avoid share investments in fossil fuel corporations. I think I've run out of time. Have I,
It's
Zahra?
okay, no problem with that, Dr. Daud. Once again, thank you, Dr. Daud, for your, what you have shared and for this insightful, perspective on this issue of climate change and how on the topic impacting Earth more, the rising population or excessive consumption is a question mark there. What you have shared, I think we need to understand that you have said as Muslims we need to realize that our life in this earth is like a journey, so travel light with regard to our behavior of being a consumer, so that we realize we can actually contribute positively to the changes that might come in the future with regard to this, and what we will be inheriting the earth, the kind of earth to our future generation, Dr. Daud. Once again, on behalf of IKIM Radio, I would like to thank Dr. Daud Bachelor for being with us on this episode of Open Forum. To our fellow listeners, thank you again for being with us and listen to Open Forum again next week on other interesting topics. And thank you to my producer Haja Mazlina Ismail. With that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa